Well, we had an email question from Lee. This is a really good question. He's reading the New American Standard version of the Bible in 1 Samuel 18 and verse 10. It says, now it came about on the next day that an evil spirit from God came mightily upon Saul. And then chapter 19, verse 9, now there was an evil spirit from the Lord on Saul. And of course, the obvious question it brings up is, as he says, I don't understand God sending an evil spirit. Did he just allow Satan to do so, or what's going on there?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and there's really three ways to look at it. Again, Lee, it comes up even earlier in the book of 1 Samuel. In 1 Samuel 16 and verse 14, we are told that a transition is taking place. King David has been anointed by God to be the next king of Israel. King Saul had pushed the envelope too far. He had disobeyed the Lord. He had taken spiritual matters into his own hands, even going so far as to offer a sacrifice without waiting for Samuel to be there. And God took that as a definite, you're getting too big for your britches. And it's really interesting when you take a look at Saul psychologically, because he started out so petrified of being called by God to be king over Israel, that he actually, when Samuel came and said, we're going to name the king, God's going to identify him, they were casting lots and fell down to the tribe of Benjamin, fell down to Saul's family, fell down to Saul himself. They go, well, where's Saul? And he was hiding in a bunch of baskets. He didn't really even want the title. But we're told that, in a sense, God is dealing with Israel through this man, because Israel asked for a king so they could be like the other nations. And Samuel was heartbroken about it. And God said to Samuel, don't let this break your heart, Samuel. They're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me as king over them. But go ahead, give them a king. They were already warned in Deuteronomy chapter 17 that when they got a king, this king was going to, tax them into the Stone Age and give their children as fodder for wars and so on. And 1 Samuel 17 gave some really important guidelines that this king needed to follow in order not to fall away, including, but not limited to, writing out his own copy of the Law of Moses. So he would always have it to consult with. Well, it doesn't appear that Saul ever did that. And God's Spirit came upon Saul, used Saul to accomplish some victories. But you can almost see that Saul's heart was turning. He kind of fell in love with his own success at that point. And it's really interesting how a person who starts out painfully insecure will ride the pendulum and become incredibly egotistical on the other side of the coin. And I think it's like you said, people keeping their eyes on themselves.
Yeah.
Either too much to the negative or too much to the positive. And so when we come to this place in 1 Samuel 16, God says, I'm going to send you, Samuel, to the house of Jesse, and you're going to anoint the next king of Israel. Samuel's even kind of caught up on it. He looks at David's big brother Eliab, and he sees he's this big, strapping guy, very impressive, and God has to pull him back. He says, don't look upon his stature or his countenance, for I've rejected him. For God sees not as a man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. In other words, Samuel was ready to make the same mistake all over again. Jesse brings out all of his sons. Finally, Samuel says, is anybody left? Oh, there's my youngest son, David. He's just out there watching the sheep. You can't be interested in him. And lo and behold, he's the guy. So as the Spirit of the Lord came upon David, from that time forward, we are told, something very interesting happens to Saul. In 1 Samuel 16 and verse 14, it says, but the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and a distressing spirit from the Lord troubled him. And Saul's servant said to him, surely a distressing spirit from God is troubling you. Let our master now command your servants who are before you to seek out a man who's a skillful player on the harp, and it shall be that he shall play it with his hand when the distressing spirit from God is upon you, and you shall be well. So Samuel said to his servants, provide me now a man who can play well, and bring him to me. Well, again, this ended up being King David. And when this distressing spirit would come upon Saul, David would play his music. He would sing some of the psalms that he probably composed while he was out there watching the sheep, like Psalm 23, and Saul would calm down at that particular point. So, some translations will render this an evil spirit, and they will say that, Saul was demon-possessed at this point, and they'll make the point that, Jesus said that when a demon is cast out of a house, it goes in arid places and it doesn't find rest, and it comes back to the man, we were told, that it came out of, and says, this is swept clean and empty. I'll get 7 spirits worse than myself. And so the last condition of that man is worse than the first. And some will say that because Saul had turned his back on God, there was this emptiness, and into that emptiness came an evil spirit. Well, that's possible. There's 2 other explanations, though, that this could have been a demonic attack, a distressing spirit. In other words, God, in a sense, because Saul had taken a step back, the classic hedge about him that Job speaks of is taken down, and Satan's pretty much allowed to have his way. And I think there's something to be said for that, because in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, Paul talks about a guy who is so involved with immorality that it even grosses out the Corinthians. And the Corinthians weren't grossed out by much.
Right.
In fact, they pretty much indulged everything you could possibly think of. Well, this guy was involved with an adulterous affair, most scholars believe, with his own mom. And the Corinthians were tolerating it and patting themselves on the back. Oh, we're so gracious, we'll allow this to continue on. And Saul says something really interesting. He goes, look, I'm going to turn this guy over to Satan for the destruction of his flesh, that his spirit might be saved on the day of Christ Jesus. People ask, what does it mean for God to turn you over to Satan for the destruction of your flesh? Well, I don't know, and I want to find out.
Right.
But most scholars believe that is that taking back of that protecting hedge, if you will, around an individual that God will use for a disciplinary purpose.
Yeah.
You want to walk away from me, all right, have it your way, but good luck in this world, because Satan's going to work overtime to go after anyone who's associated with or belongs to God. So there's that possibility that this was an attack on Saul's psyche, if you will. Again, the idea of a spirit of discontent that was in Saul's heart. There's that old saying, the most miserable creature on planet Earth is a disobedient Christian, because they got too much of Jesus to be happy in the world, but too much of the world to be happy in Jesus. Right. And, you ask my opinion on all of that, I think it's probably number 4. Saul had tasted and seen that the Lord was good. He had seen God move in power within his life, and he turned away from all of that. And, there was this emptiness. There was this remembrance of what it was like to walk with the Lord, and there was this horrible emptiness that he had to live with each and every day. So, rather than getting into this idea that, there was this distressing spirit, that Saul was demon-possessed, and, it would kind of come and go. Well, the question I have along that line is, why then was David playing praise music therapeutic to him? I mean, if you're possessed, you've gone all the way over and given yourself fully over to Satan. The last thing in the world you're going to want to listen to is the original harp and 10-stringed lyre version of Psalm 23. You're not going to want to listen to God's word at all.
Right.
So it was interesting how that brought calm to the heart of Saul in a therapeutic kind of a way. So, when we see this distressing spirit from the Lord troubling him, we can say, well, okay, God allowed this distress on Saul's life because he wasn't going to bless his mess. He said, well, I'm going to just give you this sense of peace as you continue to go over the spiritual brink. Right. I think it was God's way of trying to bring this guy back. And, unfortunately for Saul, it never really worked. He just continually fought against God. And finally, God said to him, when he pushed it so far, he went to see a medium in Endor because God wasn't answering him, and Samuel wasn't around to give him a pep talk anymore. And obviously, he was trying to persecute David. At that point, God allowed Samuel to come back and said to Saul, why you brought me up here? You're thinking, because God isn't answering you, you're going to get answers from me. Okay, here's your answer. This time tomorrow, you're going to be in the place of the dead, you and your sons. The Philistines are going to have their way with you, and lo and behold, that happened. That always raises the other interesting question. Do you think we're going to see Saul in heaven? I'm asking you.
Your
first question. I told you I'd get you with
Why
one.
don't you tell me what you think, Scott? Man, well, that's up to the Lord, of course, but I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
I
don't want to take on the role of...
and that question always comes up, and there's people who will say, then obviously, if he's seen mediums and God takes him out and so on, that he's done and all of this. Well, I was talking to a friend of mine earlier today about the Hall of Fame of Faith in Hebrews chapter 11. And in Hebrews chapter 11, we see some interesting individuals that are mentioned there. Two of whom, I could mention that start out okay and really took a header. Gideon. The guy, was put forward as a great man of faith. And he was at the beginning, but at the end, he's kind of setting up idolatry and hands the baton of faith off to his son, Abimelech, who is probably one of the most seedy characters you'll ever find in the Bible. At the end of his life, he didn't seem to be doing all that well.
Yeah.
How about Samson? Guy that was used by God, and God gave him the power one last time to use his strength and, delivered Israel from the Philistines. But, you look at a guy like Samson, and a guy that started out with the Nazirite vow, and a guy that was used so mightily by God, but then he had his own weak point and so on. You can make a great case. Gideon, Samson, and Saul belonged in the same category. Yeah. How interesting, though, that those two people are mentioned in the Hall of Fame of Faith.
Yeah.
And I think it tells us something, that God looks at people a lot differently than we do. Now, the fact that we're having this debate, in a sense, over whether Saul was saved or not, I think kind of comes down to a really important point. I don't want to live my life in such a way that when I pass away, people are going to go, you think Scott's in heaven?
Yeah, maybe.
Boy, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's what as you were talking about this passage, what kept coming to my mind is, I want to be a quick learner, in my life with God. I don't want to be in a place where he removes any protection or hands me over to Satan or any of those things, or get away from me, I never knew you. Just like you were saying, I want to be absolutely sure that I'm walking with the Lord. And like you said, these, especially if you grew up in church with Sunday school and you read about these Bible characters in the Old Testament and David and Goliath and all these highlights, man, these people of great faith. But then as you start to study the Word, they did what? They had how many wives? They did
These aren't
the people that that I thought they were. But it speaks to God's, like you say, God's seeing us differently to how we look at each other, and God's amazing grace.
Yeah.
And the people that He says, this is my guy. This is a man or woman after my heart, and it's fascinating.
Yeah, and it answers another objection that always comes up. Is that, isn't the Bible just especially the Old Testament, isn't that just a rah-rah group, or rah-rah book for Jewish nationalism? All these heroes, Israel forever, turn back never. And whenever anybody brings that up, I would kind of smile and say, have you ever read it?
Right.
Just read
they really
it.
Painted him in good.
and read it. Read about how these individuals are portrayed.
Yeah.
They're not gussied up. They're not, edited for general audiences.
Yeah.
Israel is not. It just tells us that, first of all, the sobering truth: God looks at us all with an unblinking eye.
Yeah.
But secondly, He also looks at us through the eyes of His amazing grace.
Yeah.
And I just always go back to Romans chapter 5 and verses 6-8, where it says, for when we were still helpless at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly.
Right.
For perhaps for a good man, someone might die, and for a righteous man, someone might even dare to die. Mm-hmm. But God demonstrates His own love towards us, and while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Man, that's my only hope. Mm-hmm. Because every time I, start to get a little puffed up and say, well, Lord, I'm doing this and this and this, The wicked one can turn around and say, yeah, but you're doing this and this and this, and you got this
Yeah.
bad attitude. And you got, So, I guess, Lee, I hope that answers your question. I really think that what Saul was experiencing was what Saul, in a sense, wanted in life. He didn't want the plan and the peace of God that comes out of being a part of his purpose and plan. He wanted to do things his own way. God said, all right, do things your own way, but whether you like it or not when you do is a different story.
Yeah.
I think that's where that distressing spirit comes in.
Yeah.